In August of last year, the Minister of the Department of Environment, Forestry and Fisheries published for public input a non-detriment finding for the white rhinoceros. A non-detriment finding, or NDF, is a science-based risk assessment conducted by a scientific authority in relation to the international trade in a species that is listed in the appendices to CITES. This NDF included a concluding statement that it is highly unlikely that current investment from government, external donors, and private rhinoceros owners in the protection of white rhino can be sustained in the long term, and it is recommended that a legal trade in rhinoceros horn as an alternative source of funds be explored. In this presentation, I will be explaining how the scientific authority arrived at that conclusion. First of all, by highlighting the key outcomes of the NDF that was undertaken, looking at the information that was collated on the poaching impact, then examining some of the arguments that are put forward to oppose illegal trade in rhino horn, and then finally I'm going to look at the current legislative framework in which a rhino horn trade would need to take place. Before continuing any further, I would like to acknowledge all the contributors to the NDF. These experts provided their input, data, information, and research findings for inclusion in the NDF, some of which will be included in this presentation. When conducting a non-detriment finding, we essentially look at the vulnerability of a species in relation to the management system that impacts on that species. This can be seen for white rhino in the top figure, the red marker indicating that the rhino is at low risk from international trade. That is, that international trade is non-detrimental. That trade including the export of hunting trophies as well as live animals. A range of factors are considered when undertaking the NDF, including factors such as the distribution and abundance of the species, the legislative protection to the species, major threats to the species, control of harvest, monitoring, and these are all then scored and mapped in a radar chart, which is the bottom figure. Low scores indicate low risk, high scores indicating high risk. And again, this is another representation of the outcome of the NDF showing that the rhino is at a low risk from international trade. Two areas of concern were, however, identified. That includes the illegal offtake, which is considered to be substantial, and habitat conservation incentives, which are considered to be low. Let's take a look at the poaching impact. We are all by now familiar with graphs such as this. The figure on the left-hand side showing the number of white rhino poached since 2010. As we can see, it has increased and peaked in 2014 at 6.5% of the population and then declined in subsequent years. In 2018, it was at 4.6% of the population. The graph on the right shows how the population of white rhino has increased substantially since the 1960s and then in more recent years declined slightly due to the continued poaching pressure. We also must bear in mind that the number of incursions into the Kruger National Park continues to increase, and poaching is increasing still in other hotspots, for example in northern KwaZulu-Natal. We have also been spending a lot of money on addressing the poaching problem. For example, the Kruger National Park spends around 3 million rand per annum, and the private sector between 2009 and 2017 has spent around 2 billion rand. We have also determined that in order to secure the state-owned protected area system for rhinos with the requisite number of rangers, we would need something in the order of 0.87 billion rand and 1.29 billion rand per annum. Furthermore, income earned from the sale of white rhino is shown on this graph. In 2009, the three biggest rhino sellers sold around 370 rhinos and earned around 100 million rand. This has decreased substantially into 60 rhinos sold in 2014 and only 20 million rand earned in income. Also, the average live sale price for white rhino has decreased. In 2009, it was around 350,000 rand. In 2012, it had decreased to 250,000 rand. Interestingly, in 2013, the sale price recovered somewhat when there was a hint that South Africa may submit a proposal to the next CITES conference of the parties for a legal trade in horn. So in all, we're looking at a total loss of revenue between 2009 and 2014 at an estimated 373 million rand. Also, the 6% less net growth over 10 years equates to around 18,000 fewer white rhinos, which is around a 6 billion rand loss in asset value for the country. So, bearing in mind that almost 40% of the land on which rhinos are kept is owned by the private sector, and that the private sector owns over half the national herd, we should be very concerned about the scenario that I have just painted. That is, increasing poaching rates, resulting in increasing security costs, which have resulted in the reduction in the live sale price of animals, which result in reduced incentives to buy and conserve rhinos. So there are a few arguments that are often put forward to oppose any legal trade in rhino horn, and I will go through these briefly. The first one is that legal trade will stimulate demand and therefore poaching. However, there is no evidence in the literature to suggest that this would be the outcome. In fact, some species, such as crocodilians, have responded very well to a regulated trade. There's been massive recovery in their populations, and the legal trade has crushed the illegal supply. It is also argued that laundering will increase. However, both legal and illegal trade in wildlife occur in parallel, and therefore there is always a risk of laundering taking place. A trade-off is needed between laundering and competition, and trade bans fail because they reduce laundering to zero at the cost of giving up all competition with illegal sellers. It is also argued that consumers may prefer wild horn. However, in the absence of trade in legal horn, there is no evidence of this. Furthermore, this type of argument is based on assumptions that oversimplify consumer behavior and can lead to conclusions that do not recognize the complexity of real wildlife markets. It is also argued that the stigma effect will be nullified. However, there are no studies in the literature to prove that trade bans reduce demand through a stigma effect. Demand exists for historic, traditional, medicinal, and many other reasons, and many consumers are heedless of what governments or foreign conservation groups do or say. It's also argued that South Africa does not have a mechanism to ensure any income derived from a rhino horn trade would contribute directly to conservation. Looking at the current legislative framework, South Africa's population of white rhino is included in Appendix 2 of CITES solely for the purpose of exporting trophies and live animals. The horn itself is included in Appendix 1, and in order to export horn, one would need an import and an export permit. This would require findings of non-detriment by the scientific authorities of both the importer and exporting parties. Also, horn has to be legally acquired and may not be used for primarily commercial purposes. Now, what I've shown in orange are the additional stricter domestic measures that South Africa has put in place. South Africa requires confirmation from the importer that domestic legislative provisions are in place to ensure that the horn is not going to be used for primarily commercial purposes. We also require that the horn must be 5 centimeters in length and that it is marked. Horn taken from an animal that is captive bred is considered to be an Appendix 2 specimen. There are very strict provisions that CITES has put in place in order for an animal to be considered captive bred, and that's what I've listed there in the blue box. The CBO may also require registration with the CITES Secretariat, and it must meet the scientific authority criteria for the captive breeding of white rhino. Other than that, all the other provisions for export are the same. An export permit would be required. Only that once it reaches the other side, it can be used for primarily commercial purposes. And all exports must go through Tambo Airport. Then finally, what about the future? It is hoped that eventually the rhino will be included on the correct appendix, that is Appendix 2. These are the biological criteria for Appendix 1, and they are not met by our white rhino population. The wild population is not small, it does not have a restricted area of distribution, and there has not been or will be a marked decline in the population size in the wild. Thank you for your attention.